So we are live with this fantastic, exciting one-off recording live stream for today, not part two or anything, with Chris Cappy of Task and Purpose. No, we had a slight issue that we had to deal with, but we're back now. And we were talking about Hezbollah and the situation with the pages and the situation with the, well, walkie-talkies. But now... who knows what's going to happen next? And I was spitballing ideas and speculating. But the original topic of conversation we were going to chat with Chris was about the seemingly rather, troublesome escalation between Russia and NATO over specifically, or most of all, long-range missiles and the desire of Ukraine to want to use those, and the growing discussion, debate, divergence between members of NATO about whether or not they should or they shouldn't. So I guess very quickly, I mean, bit of context, the Prime Minister of the UK was in Washington a few days ago, and they had a very, I think, well-intended but quite probably blunt conversation with Biden, because at the end of the day, one of the most prominent examples of long-range missiles that are being discussed of being used are the Storm Shadows, which are British. And the Brits are open to them being used, whilst the Americans are not. And the policy change that came out of Washington was none. Basically, the US, I think, have talked down the British from allowing this, greenlighting this, as the US seems to have the pressure on the UK ever since really Suez 56. But anyway, Chris, I mean, what's your perspective on this? You do fantastic stuff with military perspectives anyway. So how do you view the developments in the past, 2 weeks? I guess this has really been gaining
about a week ago, we first started hearing rumors, and this is usually what you see whenever they're talking about pushing the envelope a little bit more and potentially escalating the war a little bit and giving new capabilities to Ukraine. Every single time what we see is there's little grumblings and rumors. Usually you see it in Reuters or in the press somewhere where a unnamed US official will say, we're thinking about it. Maybe, it's on our mind. And I think they do this a little bit to gather a consensus to see what people's thoughts are here. What's the reaction going to be? Basically, they float it with an unnamed source, and then they get an idea of what the reaction is. Is there wide scale? Are people rioting in the streets? Like, I can't believe we're thinking of giving missiles to Ukraine. I can't believe we're going to let them use ATACMs inside Russia. What is everyone going to say? They kind of sit back, you watch, you could see every single time. Then about a week later, then you'll start to see the formation of the actual policy that's going to happen. So a week ago, I noticed all throughout the information space, you're seeing basically they're saying Biden and his administration is thinking of authorizing ATACMs, thinking about it. Now, a week later, it hasn't actually officially happened yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to. I think they're waiting for something that necessitates it or kind of justifies it. So right. If the front line starts to collapse in Ukraine, if for some reason they start to lose too much territory inside of Kursk even, I think what you might see then is it makes it easier to justify, right? Because then you can point to that and justify it more as a defensive action instead of just we're going to give them ATACM capabilities inside Russia because we want to. No, we're doing it because they just lost Prokrovsk. They just lost another town. Now we need to give them ATACM missiles. It's much easier to paint that as a non-escalatory move in that case. And I think that kind of rhetoric is very important. Now, people are saying that Russia would potentially, that would make NATO a combatant. What does that mean? I mean, I think there's a lot more steps on the escalation ladder before you get to nuclear war. I don't think that if we authorize, or if the United States authorizes ATACM strikes inside Russia, that would mean that the next step is like a tactical nuke. No, I think there's a lot more steps before we see that happen. So there's arguments about whether or not it would make an actual major difference, tactically speaking. For instance, Russia, we know they already moved all of their aircraft out of the range of the ATACM missiles. Right. So you could argue that it wouldn't make a huge difference. They would only be able to target military targets with it, bases, troops. It wouldn't be able to strike oil refineries, for instance. So those are just my initial kind of thoughts on the escalation of it, managing that escalation, and what we might see. Because really, none of us know for certain. It could go either way. There are some indicators, though.
Yeah, I mean, no, great. Obviously, for people who are joining, this is a chat with Chris Cappy of Task and Purpose. I do my own YouTubing for those of you who are from his community. We had a great 3-part conversation before. And yeah, this is something that I wanted your opinion on, because you do an extensive coverage of it. Now, you're going to, you did say sort of, unless there was significant escalation, then the NATO alliance might sort of green light use. Some people might argue or disagree with you and say, well, indiscriminate bombing across Ukraine is sufficient enough reason to give Ukraine right to strike strategic assets, military sites within Russia, because obviously that's where a lot of these sort of aircraft and other sources of strikes come from. But that's open for debate. I think the question I have for you next is really, I'm not a military guy. I'm a geopolitical sense. I try to study as much as I can the military from a broader perspective. But what kind of assets are we actually talking about here? I've mentioned Storm Shadow, but what other units could be utilized in a sort of, like, what other long-range missiles and weapons are we talking about for that NATO?
The long-range strike weapons that I'm aware of are Storm Shadow, ATACMs, which are like cruise missiles and ground-launched missiles. That
Right.
Storm Shadow can be launched from the air. ATACMs is launched from the ground. ATACMs has I believe it's a 440 kilogram warhead on it. It's a relatively big boom, and there's also versions of it that are cluster munitions. So it's reserved for the more high value targets. So you're going to use it on command and control centers. These are the Russian headquarters that are bases that do all of the planning and operational planning for them. So they're not like what you wouldn't just fire one at a tree line. You would fire it at a S-300 launcher, or it's a strategic weapon, I would say. And it's expensive. These missiles cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you're not just gonna. So the United States produces about 500 of them a year. So people worry, like, are we giving away too many missiles to Ukraine that we're not going to have any to defend ourselves with? I don't think that that's a reasonable thing to worry about. The United States happens to produce a boatload of ATACMS missiles, so that wouldn't be a concern for me. To address real quick what you said about justification being that they're already on the defensive, they've been attacked by Russia, they're the victims of this war of aggression. Like, absolutely, I would personally view it that way, but I'm talking about it more from like a theoretical point of view, where this is the tenor of the conversation that's being had at this level. It's not necessarily like how I view it or feel about it, but this is how the people who are trying to pitch it on the world stage in front of a lot of people who aren't going to agree with it. How do you sell it to that large of an audience, basically all of Europe and the United States? So when I talk about these things, I see it a lot of times on the channel. I'll talk about something from like an abstract point of view, and people will think like this is me talking about it how I personally feel about it. But I think we have to divorce ourselves a little bit from how we feel about it and what we think is justified, and try to put ourselves in the shoes of how a person, a high-level U.S. official who has to sell this to an entire country, basically, and basically assure the American public that this isn't going to be an escalation, that in fact it'll lead to a de-escalation. That was just a real quick aside, but where was I? So I think I was talking about the actual capabilities of the ATACMs. I'm sorry if I'm very difficult to follow. I feel like my TISM
Don't
and
worry,
my
I have no idea what you're
ADD.
saying, so
Yeah.
it's fine. It's mainly the
Uh,
accent, I think. If you spoke proper British English, then I'm kidding, guys. It's I'm English. I've got to take a quick. No, I appreciate that. I think for me on the channel, I try to balance asking topical questions, but I also like to push back healthily. I think it's important to challenge one's perspective and not shy away from, well, the reality of certain things, right? We can all live in the world that we would prefer to see, but then you're going to only kid yourself when you feel that much more disappointed about something. But anyway,
Yeah, I really
so
appreciate
then,
that. I like those kind of questions. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's not like sort of, so then, and I throw a curveball about your personal
Yeah,
background
no,
or
no.
something, it's a bit more like
Yeah,
a
yeah,
sort of, well, hang on a second though, what about, you said that,
totally.
but doesn't it, yeah. Yeah, it all comes with trying to learn how to be a good interviewer. Also, if you have any questions, do drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to work them in. Rabbit Ass, who's one of the watchers, I do remember your question from before. If you could just repeat it in the chat, I promised I would ask yours about Eastern, I think it was Nordic, Eastern Europe. But anyway, so Chris, the next question I have for you really is, what about therefore this means for, I don't know, NATO unity more broadly, right? We've got different perspectives about the extent to which, I've alluded to it already, but the extent to which the support for Ukraine should continue. A lot of this, I think, depends on what happens in November. Are we just seeing NATO really, run up against a wall, if that analogy even makes sense, but you know what I mean? Or are we going to
In terms
see
of cohesion.
yeah, because there are, a lot of countries that are much more lukewarm. I said it in the previous stream while we were waiting, trying to figure out what happened. And, some countries like France, Spain, they don't meet their target to GDP of 2%. They do a little bit of free riding. And there's much more hawkish states like the British, like the Baltics, most parts of the Nordic states. I don't know. Any thoughts on this and how it plays in?
I want to put, if it's okay, I want to put a quick pin in kind of the capability. I think it is important to understand the sort of the capabilities of the long range strike, if that's okay, and then we can jump into that. So I just want to put a pin on that by saying that I want to finish by saying like ATACM missiles have already been used inside of Crimea, so we have a good idea of what impact it would have inside of Russia. So they've been used to strike communication centers. Russia has a big space satellite communication center in Crimea that was hit by ATACMs. And they're very hard to shoot down with air defense. They move very fast.
Right.
And so this is what's important. The kind of what makes ATACMs or Storm Shadow different is that they're hard to shoot down for air defense and that they can hit these really important, like they have an outsized impact on the battlefield because you're attacking their strategic assets. So nothing gets done without something being planned on the battlefield. There's basically the way combat works is that there's a command outpost and it might be 20, 30 kilometers back from the front line. And that's where all of the generals are. And they have what's called a command staff whose their job is they go on a board and they're doing live updates of, what unit is where on the map. And they're geospatially locating the battlefield in live updates. So they're the ones that are sending out the commands ultimately to the guys on the ground. Like if you're in a Russian command post, they're sending out the orders to that unit saying you need to push up this far by this amount of time, and you need to coordinate that timing. It has to happen at this time so that they are coordinating all of that. So if an ATACM missile hits that command outpost, you could imagine just how screwed you are in terms of unit cohesion, because suddenly you've lost the people that are telling you where to be and when, the people that are, coordinating the logistics for your push, that your meals depend on that command outpost, coordinating your food, getting there on time. So that's what ATACMs really can change on the battlefield, is that it gives them the capability to hit these really important targets. And one of the things that people say, Ukraine is fighting with their hands behind their back. And I believe that definitely, because Russia is able to launch long-range cruise missiles and similar systems like the Iskander missile that goes 500 kilometers. They're able to strike inside Ukraine and hit their key outposts. So, but Ukraine has more trouble doing that. It's not that they can't. They've just recently they developed their own ballistic missile. I don't know if you heard about that, but
yep. That was my next question.
Yeah. So we'll get into that. But so yeah, I just kind of want to paint a picture of why Ukraine, from their point of view, why they're saying it's important that they get this capability, and kind of what it might change in the equation. Is it going to be a silver bullet weapon system? Is it going to win the war for them? Probably not. But will it make a big difference in terms of what's happening in Kursk? I think it would. So yeah, that's just wanted to explain that bit a little bit more. And then, so your next question was about the cohesion of NATO and the different countries in NATO. If is that my understanding? Like, how
Well, it
are
was
they
sort of, it
getting?
was all interrelated, really, the sort of relationship of the strategic thinking, if you want, decision making at the upper echelons of the NATO alliance, and how that whittles down into the operational and tactical levels. But can we put a pin in that for a second, because I want to focus on more this level, and then we'll sort of work ourselves up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because the follow-up question after that was basically, you've touched upon it with the ballistic missile developments, but one of the things that I think a lot of people have noted and emphasized is how much the Ukrainians are able to do quite a lot with not very much. Obviously, people who are much more, well, the Kremlinites are like, the Ukrainians are being absolutely lambasted and overwhelmed. And it's like, well, they are against the second most powerful, what we thought to be the second most powerful military in the world, second most powerful military in Russia now. I like that joke. But, it's they are doing a lot with their hands, maybe not fully tied, but certainly restrained. And so this development of in-house ballistic missiles, right? That's a pretty big step for a country that is, well, it's not the wealthiest nation in the world. It's got a lot of issues internally as well, and it's, well, in the middle of a major war. I don't know. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah,
How do you see that?
the ballist. So I think it was August 27th that Zelensky announced that they had developed and test fired a ballistic missile successfully, and it's supposedly similar to the capabilities of Russia's Iskander launcher, which
Okay.
most people know what this looks like. It's that erector thing that kind of, the missile is straight up like this on a vehicle, and it fires. It goes 500 kilometers. It's got accuracy within, they say, within like 30 to 70 meters of where you aim, you will hit, which is pretty good. Some versions of it are claimed to be within 5 and 7 meters of the target. So that's what I think is comparable to what we could expect to see from this Ukrainian home built, domestically produced ballistic missile. I would guess that it would be on par with that. It's a much larger warhead than your ATACM, for instance. There's no restrictions on it. How they were able to do it, they've been developing this in one form or another since the Soviet Union collapsed. They had a lot of the production facility for ballistic missiles specifically was located in Ukraine. So they, at different points in time in their history over the past few decades, they've either kind of doubled down on the development of a ballistic missile, or they've backed off. I believe it was Yanukovych who canceled the program for a while, and then the next president of Ukraine after that then reinstated it as a different name. So it's been under different names and forms. They've worked with the Herm-2 missile, and they had the Sapsin missile. So Ukraine's been working on this for a while. Something that I think is interesting to note is that one of the things that might change the calculation here, Iran recently sent many ballistic missiles to Russia. And that was one of the things that that really, I think, was what prompted the discussions about whether or not the United States now should send ballistic missiles to Ukraine, because that was kind of part of the, like, well, you're using ballistic missiles from your allies. Doesn't that open the door for us? I watch a lot of court and trials, and you'll always hear them say, well, this opens the door for that. And I think it's kind of a similar legal justification when you talk about war, because people treat it in a very legalese way. It's like, well, you did this, so now it's fair for us to do it. And it's kind of one of the only ways to really to think about how these things operate on that level.
No, certainly, and I don't think we can shy away from the implications of this war on international humanitarian law. It's something I ask a lot of people when I interview them, including Lawrence Friedman, for example. I actually did a podcast with some members of the Red Cross earlier in the year, because I was just like, this is so, it's changing everything, right? And this whole idea of the use of might is right, hard power is a way to get what you want, or sort of what is a compliance strategy, right? The use of compliance strategy seems to be growing again. It's a fancy way of people who aren't aware of saying that, you get people to comply by either using force or showing signs of force, a bit like Venezuela did in Esquibo with Guyana in December. So, okay, I'm curious for your perspective on them. You mentioned the NATO thing, so let's bring in this element about the sort of divergence, or just generally, maybe that's too strong a word, but there is definitely not full unity, cohesion in NATO alliance, and then as I said earlier on, it's this infighting or skepticism amongst certain states, well, obviously Hungary being one notable factor, that is undermining this. So how do you see this at the broader level, and how that's influencing operations and comms and such logistics on the ground?
I always feel like it's almost difficult. I have to change gears and rethink about things when I think about the NATO alliance, because then I try to reframe my perspective to, okay, if I was living in Europe, how might I view this war differently than how personally as someone in America might view it? And
Right.
so let's assume that there's disunity in NATO, some amount of it. Why would that be? I would think that there's different incentives in Europe. So for certain countries are more dependent on Russia for things like gas and their economy, and for political reasons as well, I'm sure. Factors that maybe don't impact. It's easy for me to say, "Hey, we should support Ukraine for X, Y, and Z." But if I'm trying to understand why some countries in NATO don't, I would have to assume it's the war's been going on now for so long that I think we're going to probably hear more and more louder voices calling for some kind of resolution. And that's going to upset people who want to see Ukraine get their land back from Russia, and who believe that if we don't do that, then we're just incentivizing Putin and bad behavior like this, essentially, to put it in uh, Barney style, dumbed down layman terms. But that, to me, you know, I don't know that NATO is at a point where there's that much disagreement. I think everyone is, it seems to be, at least to me, that they're going to continue funding the efforts to stop this war. I mean, to continue Ukraine's defense. I don't know. Are you getting a different sense that that there's growing calls for an end to the war?
Well, I mean, as the host streamer, I have to balance trying to make provocative statements for engagement versus being realistic with the reality of the situation. No, I'm being slightly facetious. No, I think, no, largely speaking, of course, the unity to continue to support Ukraine is there. What I would emphasize is that we've seen a significant political transition, or just shift in the past few months. This is the year of elections. More people, I think it's over 60 nations, are going to the polls. We've had some very influential ones and unexpected ones in the form of the French election, and then the parliamentary ones in Europe, let alone the one in Britain. I mean, Olaf Schultz and the AfD result, they're now running higher at 18% than the SDP governing party of 15%. The point is that there's a lot of things in flux, and so there's a lot of smaller. I think we need to do more accountancy, or take more account of the domestic pressures and situations within each state, more than we are doing, and how that is inevitably still impacting. Obviously, Hungary has made threats, but then sort of stood back and not really followed through. Vucic, although he's not in the EU and NATO, but he's hedging with China and stuff. So there's a lot of war of words, but then actually follow through with action is, well, there's a lot of beating of the chest and stuff. So
What I've noticed is it maybe grumblings of, like, I feel as though I've noticed a bit of like a turn in terms of the amount. Like when the war first happened, there people were very on board with Ukraine and its defense. And then now I think the Russian information space does a pretty good job. It might be paranoid thinking of me to say that, people don't have agency or that this isn't their genuine belief, but I think that they've done a pretty good job of turning a lot of people who at the start of the war were like, this is not right, who now are saying more of what Moscow would like them to be saying, I think.
No,
We
I
saw
mean,
that they were paying some pretty high profile influencers in the United States, and how much influence that really bought them, I don't know. But I think these things start to just chip away at the support for Ukraine. And that's their goal, is to chip away at that base.
as with everything, there's a spectrum, and support for Ukraine is a spectrum in the sense you've got absolute hardline people who will do anything to support Ukraine. You know, NATO, for example. Then you've got people who support Ukraine, but as time has gone on, other things have taken, precedence. Inflation, living cost, things closer to home. I'm thinking sort of, for example, in the US, right? So things do ebb and flow, and I think that the Russian disinformation efforts across Europe are very effective. I just released a second part video with a chap called Keir Giles, who's a fellow at Chatham House, all about this sort of stuff and the influence of Russia. It's very effective. It's also very cheap. And the West hasn't done enough, I think, of an effective way of either one, finding a way to counter it, or two, just doing it ourselves in some kind of, relatively similar way or different. I don't know. But like, it's definitely happening. And the, acquisition of X, Twitter, by Musk has really, really helped with that, because there is no other app like X that is focused on real-time news, developments, politics. Meta, I'm not defending them, but they're a little bit more, it's more to do with photos and food and shit, right? So X controls and monopolizes a space where information in real time about developments can be very heavily hijacked very quickly. And I definitely think the Russians, well, clearly, as you said, Tim Pool and others have utilized and leveraged as well. So no, it's a major concern like that, and I do wonder whether NATO will continue to have the at the moment. Sure, it's still there. I think the main thing is about red lines with Putin. Although how many times have they said this? So that kind of leads me into a next question, which I've also seen a couple of people mention, which is sort of how far should we still be restrained on the threats that the Kremlin make? Particularly the US seems to really be worried about the red lines of Russia still, despite them having said many and them never really following through. So I don't know. What's your assessment there?
I think they are a little bit following through. I think we don't hear about it all the time, but I think that there's something of a low level spy war going on in Europe. We've seen a number of warehouses hit with arson attacks. We've seen, and these are Russian agents, I believe. They found ties to them. There's a unit called, I think it's GRU. I forget the digits, but it's a GRU unit that their whole job is to sow chaos and to disrupt aid to Ukraine. So I would think if I was Russia, my next move, if I'm worrying about escalation, would be that they would start attacking that aid more overtly. So you would see those railroad tracks they try to derail them. We would see more explosives attacks on warehouses that keep the aid. That would be the next line. People are waiting for nuclear war. I don't think that's what we would see, but there are other things that Russia could do that would be a major pain that the United States wouldn't want to see happen. And with that information space, I'll say there's also, right now, a lot of people pay attention to how the right is being a little bit hijacked we'll call it, they're sort of aligned with Russia on some instances. I think a lot of people also forget that the left gets hijacked by Iranian influence campaigns frequently, and you'll see people are fundraising for Hamas, not realizing it. So it's something that we all have to try to be cognizant of, to not be tools of foreign influence.
No, indeed. Okay, so what about I don't know, what would be the response? Very simply, what do you think there would be a military response by the Russians? I'm very skeptical in my studies of Russia that they would bomb their own country. I had what's that US Civil Defense Network? I think it's a spam account bot account. It's full of bullshit. But they basically said, breaking, Russia is considering bombing its own country to show the impact of the bombings. Oh, sure, yeah, no, let's bomb Siberia. That's fine. Yeah. Just the logicality of these counts on X is hilarious. What do you think? Like, would Russia, I don't know, use more indiscriminate attacks? Would they use even more thermobaric bombs, for example, against troops in Kursk? I don't know. What options do the Russians have?
I forget if we talked about this last time, but did we go over how they're basically changing how they're targeting? Before they were targeting the power distribution networks, and now they're targeting power generation networks.
No,
So
break that down. That's a great point. No, do so.
I forget if I talked about that last time, but one of the big escalatory things that, yeah, because that gets way more clicks and views and goes viral when you say that they're going to nuke their own country, or they're going to bomb their own country, or they're, whatever it is.
We'll bomb our own country. That'll show the DC blob.
That'll get them. Got them. But what I think we're seeing is this: you can make a big difference by the type of targets that you choose. And before the beginning of the war, they were targeting the power distribution networks, which was a pain, but like you can fix that in a month, let's say. And let's say that costs $10,000 to fix a distribution center. That's a big difference than they were targeting the power generation, which that takes years to fix and literally billions of dollars to fix. You're attacking the power plants. So that makes it much more difficult for Ukraine to continue their war effort, makes it difficult to produce drones. So those are the type of escalatory attacks that Russia could make, and they make it with cruise missiles and long range strikes. So what else could they do? I can't imagine, because they're also stretched so thin across the front line that I don't know what else they could do.
Yeah, so I've got it here for those of you who are interested. I just retweeted it, but it's a lovely, obviously edited and enhanced. I think that's actually the US where that bomb is going up. But update: Russia is preparing to test a nuclear weapon inside Russia to remind the West the might of the nation with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The test can happen at any time. Couple of points there, though. Actively deployed missiles. I think the US has overall more missiles. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, tit for tat, they've got like a handful. That's, to be honest, guys, like 6,000 a piece. I'm not sure whether it's 6,012 or 5,998 is going to really deter one or the other. Anyway, okay, interesting. So one of the questions we had from a viewer, and I've seen repeated a couple of times, is obviously with the addition of Sweden and Finland, this is the other benefit of Russia. Obviously, Putin showed NATO now he's got the longest singular border that he didn't have of 800 miles extended that he has to worry about. What do you think the Nordic states could do, or the eastern part particularly?
It's interesting. They're working on that right now. The United States Army, for the first time, just did a landing exercise where they practiced offloading several hundred armored vehicles in Norway for the first time, to kind of as a proof of concept, to show that, because basically, if in the event of hypothetically, not even just war with Russia, but like a escalation that called for a deployment, you would have to arrive at different points throughout Europe. And one of those points, a new point of entry, is in Norway at a port called Narvik. And so you would drop off like a battalion size or brigade sized element of light infantry there, and then they would convoy to basically the border with Russia through there. And there's different rail networks that you can use, that you can exploit to go that way. But that, to me, is one of the big, from like an American perspective, from adding more countries to the alliance. It's not, people look at it and they're like, well, what army do they really bring to the table? Like, is that really going to make it? It's not about what their tanks or their infantry bring to the table so much, although that is certainly welcome. It's more about what it opens up in terms of, I like to look at it like a game of Settlers of Catan. Like, you now can have, it's an American board game, but
China.
basically it opens up new possibilities. And if you look at it like a board game, you see that it's not so much about the units that you're adding, but the transportation routes that are opened up, because all of these routes are going to be contested by Russian missiles. So to me, that's the big thing about adding new countries to the alliance, is the transportation routes that it opens up, which then let you be more distributed, and you're harder to predict of where you're going to be. Because before that, it was pretty easy to predict where the Americans were coming from. They were coming from Germany, and they were being put on trains to go through Poland. And you need to have 6 or 7 redundant in any area that you work in, no matter, probably everyone that's listening, wherever you work, you need to have redundancies built into your systems. And so to me, that's one of the big parts about enlarging the alliance, if that was the question. But one last thing about the bombs. So now that I hear what that tweet was, it's provocative, but not unreasonable to think that eventually, if we continue down a route of escalation, yes, eventually what we will see is, I think, before a nuclear attack on people, we would see a warning detonation. They would detonate a nuclear bomb, not probably over ground. They probably do it over water somewhere, a nuclear test, because we haven't done that in decades now, both sides. So yeah, that would be the next big, or not the next, but like several steps down, what we would see.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, it's I remember doing my masters at SAIS, and one of the things one of the courses I took was nuclear strategy, and I thought it's really interesting because they said, in the use of them against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, the US could have simply dropped them in the Bay of Japan, or Sea of Japan, right, or something like that as a symbolic strike. Why did you necessarily have to use it against the civilian sites? In the case of Russia, the most sort of the one I've repeated the most scenario, and I think quite feasible, albeit again, I'm not making any claims here, is drop a tactical nuke, or a tactical nuke somewhere in the Sea of Azov, or something, because it does enough of a symbolism that the Ukrainians can feel it, but doesn't necessarily impede the Russians too much, in terms of their maritime and strategic interest down there. I'm still not sure, because also from an international law perspective and just optics perspective, there's a question on China that I'll bring in a second, which obviously comes to this. If Putin does that, I mean, we talk about precedents all the time, right? This word is so overused, but like, it really would change and set a precedence with that. Not just any power, but a great power is taking the step to use there's a fantastic academic called Nicole Grodzinski, who's part of the ATOM team in Harvard, that I've had on a couple of times in the show, and she does Russia but also nuclear stuff, and she's made that very abundantly clear. So it's not just the sort of the symbolism of the strike itself, it's the symbolism of what precedents it sets for the international diplomacy and how other countries, namely China and India, would react. But yeah, I think I did want to ask you another question from David, actually, which I thought was quite interesting, which he said, what's your take on China's role in supplying Russia? I was going to bring in the element of China's nuclear in a second, sorry. But specifically, we saw that the Russians are developing these kamikaze drones, and they're utilizing, I believe, software or some kind of chips or something from China. That was in a report in Reuters or FT. I can't remember if you've seen that, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And David's question.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised we haven't seen more support from China for Russia. It's interesting that, but it's still, to me, what I noticed is the biggest kind of way that China is supporting Russia is with the gun cotton, the nitrocellulose that China has in great supply, that they very interestingly recently stopped supplying to Europe, who also needs nitrocellulose to produce artillery shells. So China is a big provider of that to Russia. Also, like you mentioned, some of the higher technology pieces like that help Russia with their cruise missiles and more sophisticated weapon systems. You see you see Chinese technology helping with that, with the machine tooling, because the way to manufacture a lot of these high tech systems are that level of precision when it comes to machine tooling. And I think one of the reasons that the West, I believe personally, just my personal opinion, has some of the best weapon systems in the world, the most reliable, the most deadly, is because we cooperate across our entire supply chain through Europe. You know, HIMARS rockets are made at something like 100 different facilities spanning 30 different countries and different states in the United States. So this level of cooperation in the West when it comes to our weapon systems allow us to have an advantage when it comes to thermal optics, when it comes to weapon systems, but you don't see that same level of cooperation across the authoritarian countries, not yet anyway. And if we do start to see it more, probably not a good sign. Their weapon systems will probably improve if they do. Now, on the other hand, of that, when you rely on another country for your weapon supply, that's also a little bit of a weakness because now you're relying on each other. So
Yeah.
there is a pro and con to China and Russia supplying each other. For China supplying Russia, um, it's not as bad as I would have predicted yet, but yeah, they're doing it in ways that aren't overt. They're not sending straight up artillery there yet. They're not sending lethal aid yet, which that's yet another escalation to look for. That would be a bad day if we see China sending, actual vehicles there. But we are seeing a ton of North Korean equipment showing up there. And you could argue that China is sending equipment to North Korea, which is then sent to Russia. So that's a fun discussion.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, on the face of what you said, I think, I think Russell Whiskey makes a good point. China still recognizes Ukraine's 91 borders. They do actually, but I think what they have primarily given, at least the way that I've seen it termed, is non-lethal aid. If that begins shifting into lethal aid, but now sort of we're in this grey area of like, well, does technology that's used within a kamikaze drone built in-house in Russia count as lethal aid? Are the Chinese doing it knowingly? And that leads me to another point. And then I want to obviously branch out a little bit more China-Russia relations strategically or strategic level, but like, is that, China doesn't want too much. Right, it doesn't want secondary sanctions, that's for sure, because at the end of the day, China heavily benefits still, whether or not people like to admit it, from the current prevailing economic system. And that's why the strategic partnership between Russia and North Korea, I think, is so important in terms of how the Chinese didn't react with positivity. They basically said nothing, if anything, kind of not very happy at all, because those two countries are ostracized enough that they can kind of get away with this, whilst China's so integrated still that it doesn't benefit them, at least for their own domestic interests. But, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on what I've said there, or do you think the Chinese could up the ante and just go for it all in on supporting Russia, especially as we come to this fray of, potential long-range missiles in Russia, or not?
The thing I find fascinating about foreign affairs is that we can all look at the same thing happening right in front of us and have very different takes on like why it's happening. What is the relationship between China and Russia? I've seen people are convinced that it's adversarial more than it is cooperative, and that China is doing everything it can to make Russia a junior partner and to really like take advantage of them and take advantage of this position that Russia's put itself in where they've weakened themselves. And that's the story. That's the narrative. Then there's other people that don't see it that way, that believe that what we're witnessing in terms of the international relationship between Russia and China is that it's becoming more simpatico, as we would say in New Jersey. And so I am fascinated by what is really underpinning this relationship between the two of them. Is it a little bit of both? Like when Russia recently it was touted as like Putin's Asian tour, right? He went to North Korea and he secured a new friendship, of cooperation, of best friends forever with a big heart. I think they got, and they got even plaques out of it. So yeah,
Yeah.
right. So they're BFFs, but people look at that and they're like, well, Putin's doing that to stick a finger in the eye of China. And like, I'm sure you could find evidence to support that case. And you could also find evidence to support, no, Putin, North Korea, and China are working together. So I find it really interesting. I would love to be a fly on the wall of those meetings and to know, you know, what is really motivating them. I'd love to know. But yeah, what do you think about that relationship?
Oh boy, the Sino-Russo relationship is arguably one of my favorite things to think about because well, the whole great power, what I call the strategical triangle, right? Russia, China, and America. Arguably, should put India in there increasingly in certain ways, or the EU or supranational entities. But I think it's really fascinating, to be honest, Chris, because I think the Chinese feel they need to do one thing, but they also know that they can't fully do it because they require the other thing. What I mean is that they want to utilize, look, it's a marriage of strategic convenience. The Chinese utilize the Russians for resources, and they have always had, I think, they've had grievances about the Manchurian borders conflict between the Russians and the Soviets and the Chinese in 1969, 70, something like that. And that provocative map that China released in August of last year, they claim territory from everybody, or Tibet entirely, or whatever, but Russia included. And you've got Lake Baikal, the largest standing body of fresh water in the world, and you've got China. I've probably made this to point to some people watching a million times, but like, they're buying private MNCs. The Chinese are buying up land around. I'll stop doing that. Around the lake, so that they can have better water security in the future. And it's basically a new form of sort of land grabbing. The Russians don't have the ability, the capacity. They can barely support their own CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, last year with Armenia, right? That's a dead organization. So they don't have enough bandwidth to manage their own southern border in the southeast. So the Chinese are definitely playing advantage of that. The Chinese and Russians have growing divergences over the Arctic. So I definitely think, were this mutual resentment of US-led order not as strong as it was, those two would definitely not be as close as they are. But I don't know. Maybe I'm speculating it, and that's complete bollocks. So no, I don't know. I don't think the Chinese are ever going to supply the Russians. They would have done it by now. This whole idea of a peace plan is just that they proposed in March last year is just well, for their own performative politics, let's be honest, to be seen. China wants to be seen, or Xi wants to be seen as creating this new led alternative to the US and legitimize itself as the other pole. So no, I don't think the Chinese are that invested in Ukraine. They couldn't give a shit. No offense, I do, but I don't think they do. And Russia is but a vassal or a vessel to greater interests and means. But I don't know. Any other thoughts? Any pushbacks?
Yeah, let's assume that that's correct. Let's assume for a second that that's
You're
the
very generous.
reality of the situation, which I let's say that that's the case. I think it would explain a lot of what we're seeing, because I would think that the United States doesn't want Ukraine to win by too much. They don't want to see anything drastic. They don't want to see Ukraine retake all of their land, because that would push escalation and make things more dangerous. If I had to guess, I would say that both the United States and China probably want the war to end. If I had to guess, like, it's in their interest for that war to be over, for them to get back to what they want to be doing. That's my guess, because like you said, like, I don't know that I'm convinced that China wants Russia to take over all of Ukraine at this point. I don't know if that's in their interest or not. I think, like you said, that they're playing it insofar as it pisses the Americans off and it makes things difficult for the Americans. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the way I see it. That's why I wouldn't be surprised if, next year there is some kind of peace agreement. just because China and the United States, I think, would like to see that. But I don't know.
No, I've got one last question for you, a pretty obvious one before we probably wrap for this great stream. And thanks for pushing through and being so generous with your time. But people enjoyed it. Also, I did drop a link actually, guys, to part 3 of my chat with Chris, because we touch upon a lot of these themes in that. We also go into, I think, the broader sort of just multipolar world and all that sort of nonsense, or buzzwords. But no, I think that you could see it in one of two ways, right? China either wants to completely restructure the world in its idea, in its image, or it wants to more subtly just reform it and coexist, but albeit with influence, because at the end of the day, China does benefit from the current economic system as well. If it didn't, it wouldn't have grown to the extent it has. But I also think that they're torn, because the Chinese are very, very far thinkers, right? We cannot and should not underestimate the long-termism that the far-sightedness that they have and approach things with in this kind of matter. But at the same time, I don't, they do kind of benefit from the war, because Russia's, selling them oil, and they've got basically unprecedented support over Russia in ways that we cannot even fathom somehow. Look at Siberia too, the pipeline, this long-standing pipeline. The Russians want it at X amount, sold. The Chinese like, no, we're going to X. So it's and the Russians don't really have any wiggle room. But on the other hand, the longer the war goes on, what does this do? It puts more and more spotlight on Taiwan. What has the Biden administration managed to do by reforming the relationship between South Korea and Japan, unheard of, right? Those two being, well, not friends, but at least amicable in the prospect of a potential conflict in the SCS. So I think Beijing's pretty. It's not one or the other. I think there's quite a difference of opinion in Beijing as well, in terms of whether they want the war to end sooner or later. Probably sooner, because it means they can continue to materialize in the quiet. But last question, and any thoughts on what I've said, is where do you see this going? Maybe we'll have another live stream soon. But do we think we'll see the Storm Shadows green lit? And if so, what could come of that? Or anything else you want to add?
When you put it that way, you make a great point. Like, there are also really great incentives to just continue the war, and maybe it's in their interest too for this thing to just keep kind of grinding on until it can't anymore, because the U.S. military industrial complex is raining right now on Lockheed and Raytheon are there. It is perfect right now for them, and Rheinmetall and all those defense contractors are making a killing. So yeah, like, there's some elements in the United States that don't want this war to end? Absolutely. That's a good point. And like you said, China is getting really cheap oil right now. So would they be stoked for the war to end? And then maybe they have a little bit less that they can put their thumb on Russia. I think that's a really good point. Are we going to see these weapon systems greenlit? I saw in my chat on my channel, people were mentioning the Ukrainian Neptune missile system, which is also very similar to ATACMs. It's a little bit less powerful. I'm not sure about the accuracy, to be honest. But so Ukraine, the point of it bringing it up is that Ukraine does have some domestic options that they've been working on, that they've been developing. How they've managed to do that is very impressive. But it's not going to be enough that, like, they could do it on their own, essentially, is what I believe. I think that they really need that green light from the United States and the UK. I personally think that we will see it once there's some kind of catalyst for it. I'd be on the lookout for some development on the battlefield or something along those lines that would then we would see that approval. And I'd be very interested to see how it actually affects the battlefield in a very tangible sense. So I'd be on the lookout for that. Yeah, it's now more than ever relevant for them because of what they're doing in Kursk. And we saw there's been a counterattack there by Russia. So I think word is still kind of out yet. We don't know how successful that counterattack has been. And anybody who says that they know at this point is cheerleading. They're, you know, if they're saying that they know what the outcome in Kursk is going to be now, when the top intelligence agencies aren't willing to say for certain what they think and that there's just a likelihood, like, I feel like you're probably pandering to your audience and you don't really know. Because it's, you can't know for certain yet. It could go either way. Ukrainians could take more land in Kursk. They're counterattacking still themselves. So I'm going to keep observing and we'll see what happens.
No, for sure. I think what the point is that, you know, a lot of Kremlinites are saying that the Russians are absolutely steamrolling them already, and that, you know, this is an absolute disaster for the Ukrainians. There's obviously a large amount of hullabaloo around those casualty numbers that came out. 80,000 on the Ukrainian side, 200,000 fatalities in that number for the Russians. Personally, I think both those numbers are, I think it's not as high for the Russians and higher for the Ukrainians. I think there's more similarity than people have said. But, you know, definitely the Russians probably have sustained more because they just, Soviet doctrine, that's how they approach it, right? Glorification of death for your country or for the motherland. But I don't know, you know, they're going to play down or build up depending upon their respective narrative. And on the China thing, one last point, I do think that it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because on the one hand, the Chinese want that cheap oil so that they can accelerate and fast track their militarization and development of new tech and materials, that because Xi, you know, wants to invade, if he were to conduct some military operation, some people reckon the best year 2027, or at least before he kicks the bucket, or before his term in 2032 and stuff. But on the other hand, if they do that, then it's very vocal and out there and stuff, so they want to do it but subtly, so they don't want the war to continue. So it's, you know, but interest on both sides. But very last point, anything you've got coming up, anything you want to shout out you've got coming up on Task and Purpose that people,
if you're interested in following me at Cappy Army on Twitter and Instagram, that's CAPPY Army on Twitter. I post my thoughts, my musings, my poetry. I don't really do poetry, but yeah, please follow me there. Task and Purpose on YouTube. We do 2 videos a week, and yeah, really great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man. It's been real fun. For those of you from Cappy's community, you know, if you enjoyed it, then I don't know, check me out. I posted a link to our first part of our chat and a couple of other chats and stuff. I post more videos than Cappy. They're not quite as quality level because our channels are slightly different. I'm also just starting out. Chris has got the know-how all behind. But anyway, thanks very much, guys. It's been a pleasure. If you enjoyed the conversation, then drop a like, subscribe, and all that stuff. And Chris, it was a lovely chat with you, and I look forward to having you back on or doing this again, you know, as and when, hopefully, as always, in better circumstances. But take care, everyone. See you around.